Rosalind Hursthouse is another amazing philosopher, and just like Julia Annis, she's going to be arguing against this normativity objection. But unlike Annis, she's going to take a completely different approach and argue that not only can virtue ethics be action guiding, it is action guiding in just the same way that, deontology or utilitarianism are. So let's talk about it. So here's premise 2 of the normativity argument that just is the simple claim that virtue ethics cannot guide action. It is not a normative ethical theory. Remember, premise 1 said that if it can't guide action, then it's not a normative ethical theory. This says that it can't guide action. And this is the premise that Hursthouse is going to attack. And so what she needs to be able to do is show that virtue ethics is on the same par as, consequentialist theories and deontological theories. That's what she's after. So what she's going to need to do is provide criterion of right, decision procedure, and theory of value. Fun little fact, this whole way of thinking about ethical theories as having these 3 parts, this is just from Hursthouse's paper. I read this paper when I was in grad school, and I was like, oh my gosh, I just love this way of thinking about ethical theories. And so this is kind of the way I teach it now. So I've had Hursthouse in my back pocket this whole time. I'm really excited you guys get to read this paper and engage with it. It's a really important, really cool paper. And even if she's not right, it's like, whoa, this is a really cool way to think about, how to put together ethical theories. So our criterion of right, that's the first thing we're going to need, and it's going to be an analysis. You can tell because it's got that if and only if. So an action is right if and only if it's what a virtuous agent would characteristically do in the circumstances. Okay? So that's what right actions are. They're actions that a virtuous agent would tend to or characteristically do. Now, the problem is, okay, fine. What would a virtuous agent do, though? Right? We still have this open question. Hursthouse is like, hang on a second. Everybody has this problem, right? So one of the nice things about philosophy is if somebody shows you your view has a problem, you just show, well, all the other views have the same problem. So I'm not any worse, right? And that's all she needs to do. She just needs to show that her view is just as good as deontology or consequentialist, utilitarianism, whatever. So here's a utilitarian criterion of right. An action is right if and only if it promotes the best consequences. Well, we can ask a similar question. What are the best consequences, right? This still leaves us with an open question. For deontology, an action is right if and only if it accords with the correct moral law. Okay, what's the moral law? Again, these have extra steps that you need in order to be able to build a robust theory. So virtue ethics is not alone here. So yeah, we've got a criterion of right. It does leave this open question, but we can answer it by saying, look, a virtuous agent is somebody who exercises the virtues. Virtues are character traits that lead to eudaimonia. Remember, that's that human flourishing. And so here's what we get. The right action is what an agent whose character traits lead to flourishing would characteristically do. Boom. That's it. So we've identified, and notice too, this is a criterion of right for action that is rooted, that is embedded in agents. We haven't lost that agent-centered focus that is, central to virtue ethics. That's super, super cool. Okay. So now that we've got that in place, we can explain, why lying to protect somebody might be permissible or impermissible, right? For a consequentialist, it's probably going to be okay if the lie produces better consequences, right, in terms of happiness or whatever our theory of value is. For deontology, remember, we just can't lie. And so we can do something else, but lying in this case would not be permissible. But for the virtue ethicist, if it's something that a virtuous agent would do, then lying would be permissible. If it's something a virtuous agent wouldn't do, then we wouldn't do it. So we've got just as clear-cut of an answer as these other two theories. It's just as action guiding. So far, so good, right? The question is, how are we going to figure out what to do? That was the problem that we kind of kicked this all off with, is how is virtue ethics going to put together a decision procedure? Well, Hursthouse is going to give us two options. Option one, ask a virtuous person. Dude, like, what a cool idea. We regularly seek advice from people whom we identify as trustworthy or virtuous, and their character does matter, right? Like, this captures this idea that Anna's kind of worried about. It's like, why wouldn't we want to take advice from loathsome advisors? Well, it's because we need virtuous agents to be able to help us identify morally correct actions. When there is no virtuous agent available, or when asking them isn't going to work or, isn't practical, we can follow the V rules. And the V rules are just like, be kind, be courageous, don't be cruel, things like that. On the one hand, a lot of work would need to be done by philosophers, by virtue ethicists, to unpack these ideas. They're what we would call very thick concepts, right? There's a lot going on there. But at the same time, it's not as if like a little kid doesn't understand what you're saying, right? If you've got a kid and they're like being mean to their brother, and you say, hey, be kind to your brother. They know what you're talking about. They don't need a philosophical treatise in order to understand like what's going on here. So yeah, there's a lot of rigor that needs to be unpacked here, but there's still like, they're clear enough to be action guiding. So that's a really, really cool idea. And again, these V rules, asking a virtuous person, these are all going to be characteristics of agents. So we're still good. We've still got that agent focus. So, again, we can make sense of why we get advice from peers, right? We don't just like go read like an ethical textbook, although like, reading an ethics textbook can be advice from, an intellectual or moral peer. We can make sense of moral development on this view. This is one of Julia Annis's big things, is like, well, look, it's something we learn over time. Well, it's all about, sort of cashing out and developing those V rules, right? A little kid has a basic understanding of like what it is to be kind, and that develops over time through phronesis, through experience, and that kind of thing. And of course, we have got a clear and workable view about the status of morality, about what makes actions right or wrong. We've got a normative ethical theory. So premise 2 of this normativity argument seems to be at least challenged, if not outright false. Now, let's look at 3 quick objections to Hursthouse. These are interesting. They are somewhat serious, but I do need to flag a couple of things. So let's just go in order here. So the virtuous agent dilemma, this is going to be a pretty serious worry for Hursthouse. The question is sort of like, okay, if I'm going to ask a virtuous agent, or if the right act is the one that a virtuous agent would characteristically do, how virtuous do they need to be? Remember, nobody's perfectly virtuous. And so, ideally virtuous agents, that can't be what we're talking about here, because nobody's like that, right? And keep in mind, part of her decision procedure is to ask a virtuous agent. If this is what we mean by virtuous agents, there is nobody available to ask. So option A, ideally virtuous agents or perfectly virtuous agents, this would kind of undermine the rest of her theory. She's got to mean this. She's got to mean sufficiently virtuous agents. But then it's like, well, okay, how this creates what's called a threshold problem. How virtuous do you need to be in order for your action to be considered, the right action? What if, you lack just quite enough phronesis and you end up kind of doing the wrong thing in this situation, but it's not necessarily uncharacteristic of you, right? Like it's almost feels kind of circular, because it's like, well, We definitely want an agent who's virtuous enough to do the virtuous, correct thing, and, thus the right thing. And the right thing is done by a virtuous agent, and those people are the ones who do the right thing, and we kind of get this little bit of a circle. So that's kind of a worry for review, and something that we can definitely talk about in the discussions. This particular objection, the self-improvement problem, I have to give a big caveat here. Well, I'll give the caveat in a minute. Let's suppose you've got somebody who's struggling with some kind of substance abuse, and we're like, okay, well, what is the right act in this particular case? And so we say, okay, well, what would a virtuous agent do in these circumstances? What would a virtuous agent do if she was struggling with substance abuse or substance addiction? And the worry to this objection is that, look, a virtuous agent just wouldn't be in this situation to begin with. I think this is kind of gross, because it almost gets this feeling of so wait, you can't possibly be a virtuous agent if you have some kind of addiction. And I mean, that is, oh gosh, that just doesn't feel quite right. Some of the most virtuous people I have met have struggled and overcome substance abuse problems or addictions of various kinds. So it's not super obvious to me that this is going the right direction. But I think the general point is maybe something like this. Let's imagine that maybe Bob is struggling with, telling the truth, and he just kind of finds himself lying a lot. There we can kind of see, right, if somebody was genuinely virtuous and they had the virtue of honesty, what would they do? Well, they wouldn't be a liar to begin with. So it kind of makes sense. I just wanted to give this big caveat here that I don't think this objection is trying to say that virtuous people or people who are addicts can't be virtuous or anything like that. I think it's more about just trying to capture this idea that virtuous agents who are genuinely manifesting the virtue in question probably wouldn't be in that exact scenario to begin with. That's all. And then finally, this idea of moral engagement, and this is just the thought that well, what if Annis is right? What if we don't want to be told what to do? It's, there is a real tension between these two views. They're kind of at opposite approaches. Both defending virtue ethics, but both doing so in really, really different ways. So, here's our summary of Hursthouse. Our criterion of right is just what virtuous agents would characteristically do. We've got a decision procedure, ask a virtuous agent, follow the V rules, and then our theory of value are just going to be, the virtues themselves, or maybe if you want, eudaimonia. And so that's going to do it. Where we are nowadays is sort of, trying to see okay, well, what are the virtues? What are the intellectual virtues? What are the moral virtues? How do they sort of play together? How is it that a virtue is, manifested as opposed to practice or something like that? But at the very least, what Hursthouse and Annis have done is they have given virtue ethics a fighting chance here against a really serious objection. And that's what philosophy is about. It's really, really cool stuff. I hope you guys enjoy talking about it in the discussions. And we're going to swing back around now that we've done our big three ethical theories to some other applied ethical issues. I'll see you then.